I've got to start over, sorry. Welcome to the Ceremon Valley Democratic Club. I am the president, Brodie Hip, and I'm glad you could join us tonight. First, I want to recognize Veterans Day. We honor our veterans for their service and sacrifice. Remember, they fought to uphold the ideals of our Constitution, including freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of the press, a right to privacy, and most of all, a government that is responsive to our needs and accountable to our oversight. And sadly, I want to point out the dire condition of some veterans. As we honor our veterans, we should think about helping our homeless population. Of the adult homeless population, approximately 11% are veterans. I put some more statistics in chat. You might have to go to the top of the chat to see them. But our democracy is saved, right? We're relieved. We've rejoiced. Some of us have danced in the streets, but our work is not over yet. We need to try to win the last 2 Senate seats. We need to try to, we all need to go phone banking, text banking, and writing postcards into Georgia to help Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock, both from Georgia, win their Senate runoff elections on January 5th. If we win those 2 seats, there'll be 50 Senate seats for the Republicans and 50 Senate seats for the Democrats. And our Vice President Kamala Harris can vote to break the tie. If you look in chat, I've put the web link where you can click to sign up to help. Everyone needs to sign up. We need to get to work. Okay. I also want to congratulate 6 of our club endorsed candidates who won. Judy Walters for Community College Board, Neil Arnrich and Dave Fong for Danville's Town Council, Sridhar Veros for San Ramon City Council, Shelley Clark and Laura Bratt for school board. So thank you, members, for helping them to victory. I know some of you really worked hard on the campaigns. So our democracy is saved. And I was hoping, okay, I was hoping that we would have Congressman Eric Swalwell here, but he is running a little bit late. So I'm going to start in, and I hope we can, I'll get through this, but I hope he'll come before we actually start our meeting. So our democracy is saved. At the same time, we are astounded by the large number of people who voted for Trump. What is going on? How can there be so many people voting for Trump? We can try to understand this phenomena by looking at Trump supporters as populists. What is populism? What needs to be done to decrease the detrimental effects of populism? Our speakers tonight aim to tackle those questions. And before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to go back and see if we have other people to admit. Excuse me. But we are honored to have Professor Terry Moe, who is the William Bennett Monroe Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, and Professor Wiliam Howell, the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics of the University of Chicago. They will discuss their book, Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy. To facilitate the talk, our club board member, Stuart Winter, will ask questions. Thank you, professors, for joining us. And Stuart, I turn it over to you.
He's muted.
Oh, okay.
All right, now I'm unmuted. I hope you can hear me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining this Zoom meeting, and a special thank you for our 2 guest speakers, Terry and William. We really appreciate it, especially William. It's now what time in Chicago? Anyway, 2 hours later, I guess. Just to what I plan to do is I've got a bunch of questions which I will put to our two speakers. I'm anticipating that will take perhaps the order of 45 minutes. And then I plan to turn it over to you guys so you can ask all the questions. And I've noticed that Eric has just joined us.
Yes.
So shall I pause and hand over to Eric?
Yes. Eric, are you there?
Yeah, thank you.
Congressman Swalwell, thank you so much for joining us.
Please. Brodie, you know that I only ask my little brothers to call me Congressman. So, well, thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Brodie. I hope you are all as in a celebratory mode as I am, because there's a lot to celebrate right now, and we've got work ahead in the next 50 some odd days to win Georgia. But on January 20, we will have President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, a Democratic majority in the House. And I believe if we do it right, we can have a majority in the Senate, but also locally, a lot of local elections to celebrate and democratically endorsed candidates. I'm really proud of Melissa Hernandez, the next mayor of Dublin, a member of our club and someone who really started from the ground floor, getting involved locally, and someone that has engaged with the party, helped other candidates, and I'm excited to see her take the mayor's office in Dublin. I want to also just bring to your attention a local issue that I've been tracking, which is that a teenager at Dublin High School organized a Black Lives Matter art exhibit this weekend at City Hall in Dublin on Sunday, and he was going to display 40 different Black Lives Matter signs and just honor the movement. And he's a part of the Tri-Valley Black Lives Matter organization. He's 17 years old, and a local Dublin resident posted on his Facebook targeting this 17-year-old and calling NRA members and Oath Keeper members to come out with their helmets and their bulletproof vests to really storm this art exhibit. And so, I hope all of us on Sunday, and we'll send out information about the event, can support Black Lives Matter locally. It's really disturbing that someone would want to intimidate and bully a teenager for a movement that most Dublin residents, I think San Ramon residents, Tri-Valley residents support. So a lot, to discuss right now, a lot of, issues to, move forward in the new agenda in Congress and with this new White House. But racial justice, thankfully, is going to be at the top of the list as we, endured a summer of, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and so many activists, Black, brown, white, and across political spectrums coming forward to say Black Lives Matter, but seeing a White House that was not receptive and not willing to make change. We really have an opportunity now to make change, and I know the club is very, very committed to that. And so, also, Brodie, if I could just, go back to Georgia. At the end of this week, we are going to be launching our effort to win the 2 Senate seats in Georgia. I have partnered with local members of Congress in Georgia, my colleagues, and we are going to be providing phone and text banking support, as well as financial contributions, not only to the campaigns. My campaign has sent the maximum contribution to both Jon Ossoff and Reverend Warnock. We sent $14,000 to those 2 candidates, which is the most that we're allowed to send. But we're working with our supporters locally to contribute to them, and also, find ways to engage and support those races. So we'll be launching that at the end of the week. And I know Ellis sent me an email yesterday asking what we'll be doing, and I hope the club will, stand ready over the next 50 some odd days to help us unite around winning Georgia, because 2 wins in Georgia means that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have a governing majority in the United States Senate, and that we can crush the virus, take on the issues of racial justice, have healthcare for all, and of course, step up and speak out for climate. So that's what I see ahead. I just today was appointed by the Speaker she called me earlier this afternoon to be in her 17-person leadership cabinet. And so I will continue to serve as the chairman of the Steering and Policy Committee. And so I'm excited to do that. And, first time in my service in the Congress where we have a majority in the House, but also a Democratic president. And so I think just locally, our constituents, whether it's on transportation issues or gun violence, which is so dear to so many of you and me, we can really, I think, see the change and the impact that we want. So, Brodie, I'm excited for what's ahead, and I'm grateful for the club and its members for engaging with us and helping us with Remedy PAC, the organization I had that did the phone banking and the text messaging for the House and the Senate. And we have our work cut out for Georgia, but I know you all are up for that.
Thank you, Eric. I'd read about what happened in Dublin just today. So if you can give us more information, that would be great. And I have already put an email link of how people can sign up through the Stacey Abrams Fair Fight.
Yes.
And if we have yours, I will advertise that too.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I told them we need to get back to work. We have to phone bank and text bank and send postcards. So thank you, thank you, Eric, for trying to psych us up and get ready for this.
Well, Brodie, the country, I think we all saw over the last week is worth, believing in and fighting for. And, Tuesday night was, it was shaky. It was unclear how it was going to play out. But I think we saw that the work that we put in locally and, of course, for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris paid off. And if you're going by Donald Trump's measurement of what a historic landslide is, Joe Biden's going to have a historic landslide win when all the votes are counted. And I just, one last thought, Brodie, because, people are texting me and asking if I'm worried about Donald Trump not, moving on and there not being a peaceful transfer of power. And I understand why, that's a concern. But the truth is, foreign leaders, CEOs, 80% of Americans polled, and most importantly, the courts in every single case filed have all said Joe Biden is the president-elect. So Donald Trump can be a play president, but we face real issues, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are up for the job, and on January 20 will be president and vice president of the United States. So I think we need to carry ourselves with confidence that that is the case, because confidence inspires confidence. And if we're panicked or worried about what the outcome, would be, I think we just give more oxygen to the game that Donald Trump wants us all to play. And again, 80% of Americans, when polled, believe Joe Biden's the next president. So we should have the confidence that that is going to happen, and that our institutions are strong enough to withstand, any cheating or denial that Donald Trump happens to be in.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for coming on and telling us.
Okay, so let me continue where I was about to go. So we'll have about 45 minutes of discussion with myself and our two guest speakers, and then we'll turn it over to all you folks who are attending tonight. And what I would ask is, if you have a question at any time, please write it in the chat, and we will be looking at that to pick questions later on. Okay, well, gentlemen, let's start out perhaps by giving us, if you can, a clear definition of what the term populist means, so that we're kind of on the same page before we start the discussion proper.
Okay, great. I'll start out with that. And thanks, Stuart. And thank you all for having us. It's a real honor for us to be here. All right, so look, I think that there's a lot of confusion about what populism means, because in ordinary language, I think people think of populism in terms of standing up for the little guy and for the disadvantaged, but we don't use the term that way, and most scholars don't use the term that way based on historical experience. It means something very different, and it's not associated with an ideology of the left or the right. At the heart of a populist movement is the belief that they represent the real people of a nation, in the United States, white, socially conservative Christian people. And they are rising up to attack a corrupt, illegitimate system. So populism pits the people against the system. And their aim is to attack that system by attacking its institutions, its norms, and its established leaders through a strongman whose job it is to reflect their rage and their grievances and to get things done. Democracy be damned. So this is why populism is so dangerous. It's not just anti-system, right? It arises within a democratic system. And it's ultimately an attack on democracy itself, led by a strongman leader. Donald Trump is a classic populist leader. He's a strongman. He's a populist demagogue.
Okay, just to expand a little on your comment about it being something that can be from the left or the right, do you see any of the current left as potential populists, like Bernie Sanders, for example?
Let me just continue that and I say, I think as we think of it, there are populist elements, obviously, to what Bernie Sanders has to say. But Bernie Sanders is a believer in democracy. He's a believer in our constitutional system. And he attacks corruption and the illegitimacy of certain aspects of the system, but he is a supporter of the American system. Donald Trump isn't, right? Donald Trump is really an anti-democrat in the sense of being anti-democracy, right? And he has been undermining the rule of law and undermining our constitutional system for 4 years. So there's a dramatic, stark difference between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Trump is the real populist.
If I could add something to what Terry has said. Well, first let me say hello and thank you for having me. It is a little bit later here in Chicago, and I'm hunkered down in my closet. My children are running about the house, and it's safer in here. I won't win any awards for beautiful Zoom backgrounds, but it's safe in here. Yeah, I want to underscore something that Terry said, which is important in understanding why somebody like Bernie Sanders is not a populist as we define it, and as most scholars who study populism define it. And that is, it's that he's not anti-democratic, but he also, the critique that he offers of the political system, I mean, he offers a deep critique of the political system, but it's in the service of rebuilding institutions and rolling out new programs. So, I mean, there's some overlap in that Bernie Sanders steps forward and doesn't just say, look, things are going pretty well. If we could just, marginally change the minimum wage and make some slight alterations to the tax code, we're good. That's not what Bernie Sanders is doing. He's offering a deep, deep critique. But all signs point to a President Sanders setting to work on rebuilding those institutions, recalibrating the work that they do. Whereas what the populist does is at every turn, sow anger and disaffection. The populist assumes this oppositional stance and carries it through all the way from the moment he justifies his run for office to throughout the time that he occupies a position of power. It's not in the service of constructive change. It's not in the service of rebuilding institutions anew, in the service of people who have been left out of the political order. It's rather in the service of tearing down. It's a destructive posture. And at every turn, the populace standing apart from the political order is meant to call upon the people to say, vest all your hopes and aspirations in me, because I'm the one who can deliver it for you. And that too is part of why they're through and through anti-democratic.
Okay, one of the most fascinating things I found when reading your book was the fact that populism nearly came to the fore in the past on a number of occasions. And it seemed as though at that time, the government at the time was able to take measures diffuse the situation, if I'm understanding correctly. Can you tell us a little bit about those past times and what action was taken by the governments, and kind of what's different now that the government doesn't seem to be able to do that?
Well, okay, I'll start out. We always have this pause, right? Where
Who's going?
You know, can go either way. Look, populism is really about anger and grievance. And a lot of it comes from these social forces that are very, very disruptive and harmful and hurtful to millions of people in the population. These are real things. And so today, these are forces like globalization and technological change and immigration that have real consequences for society that hurt a lot of people and bring anxiety. But if you go back, there are comparable periods. So 100 years ago, with the first rise of industrialization and immigration and urbanization in the late 1800s and early 1900s, these were dramatic, disruptive changes to American society. And many Americans were demanding that the government take action, but the government wasn't capable of taking action. And so that was a time when we had our first real populist movement, right? But what happened was it gave way to the progressive movement, which is the most powerful reform movement ever in the history of this country. And what the progressives gave us was real reform. And ultimately, it gave us a modern administrative state led by a much more powerful president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, right? And a more modern form of government. And it was responding by providing a more effective government to people who were desperate for it. And that's why it didn't lead to like a destructive populism. And the second thing that happened was the Great Depression, right? Just a couple of decades later, which signaled the failure of capitalism, the failure of democracy, it seemed to many people. 25% of the people were unemployed. And that was another era when we could have had a populist uprising, right? But what instead we got was the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, which was this huge, dramatic response by the government to the needs of the people and a complete restructuring of American government. And what we're saying is that something similar is happening today. We are going through a very, very disruptive period in which many people have serious concerns and grievances and have suffered serious harms. You know, they've lost jobs, their communities have been decimated, et cetera, and they are angry, and it's given rise to a populist movement. And so far, the government has not responded, and that's why we're in a crisis. So I'll turn it over to William.
And unlike the late, 1890s, early noughts, and the 1930s, here populism not only has swelled, but has broken through. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is what happens when a populist claims the power of the presidency and deploys the powers that are available to the president, not in the service, again, of fixing institutions, not in the service of solving problems, but dividing and sowing outrage and exacerbating anger and blowing on those embers until flames are there for all to see. And I think that's what we've seen in this last election as well. I mean, I agree, it's a decisive win, and thank God for that. And it's a world in which 71 million people voted for Donald Trump. And the notion that populism is going away anytime soon by virtue of this defeat, or that populism somehow we've gotten back past the crisis, is to misunderstand both the preconditions for populism, which have to do with the failures of government to solve problems, the failures of government to actually attend to the material harm and the cultural anxieties that many people feel, and also to sort of fail to reckon with simply not only the capture of populism of a major American party, which we've also seen, which is a theme that we can talk about with the Republican Party, and what it looks like again when a populist assumes the White House and deploys the powers of the presidency, not in the service of problem solving, but in the service of sowing outrage and building a populist base.
Okay, thank you. I get the impression that populism is not a uniquely American phenomenon. We can look at a number of countries where we see similar things going on. Would you like to just comment briefly about that?
Sure, I'll jump at this one. So look, it decidedly is not uniquely American, and which is why claims that the crisis that we are currently inhabiting is just about Trump, and all the atrocities are born of Trump and his idiosyncrasies, is to miss that this is a global phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that has deep historical roots. Latin America has a long history of populism, and it's a populism born of weak political institutions. It often rises up in the aftermath of hyperinflation or widespread corruption, failures of government. We see populism rising in Europe, and both Western and Eastern, in response to unmitigated shifts in immigration and perceptions that the government is not attending to the interests of average citizens. It is decidedly a global phenomenon. And what we see when we kind of canvass the globe, when we look beyond our borders and beyond this particular moment, again, we see how the claims that the system is broken and rotten and illegitimate, which are the claims that then outsiders use to push back against the democracy, are claims that resonate most in the aftermath of government failure. This is the story that we see playing out domestically. It's a story that's been playing out abroad as well.
I can just add something to that. This populism has been a force, especially in Latin America in the past. But today, it's reared its ugly head in the United States and in Britain and throughout Europe, in the developed countries of the West. And the reason for that, there are two reasons for it. One is the immigration flood that occurred in 2014, 15, 16 in Europe, coming from the Mideast and from Africa, that overwhelmed the European nations, and they didn't handle it well. And there was a huge reaction among many of the people in Europe, and it fueled a surge of populist anger in those countries. And the populist leaders really built on that to increase their popularity. And the second thing that happened is that over the last decades, globalization has led to a major outsourcing of jobs and manufacturing from the developed countries to the less developed countries. And the result has been dramatic financial insecurity for many people in the West. And those two things, the economic impact and insecurity and the cultural anxiety that's brought on by immigration, rightly or wrongly. These are countries in Europe that are very homogeneous ethnically, right? They're basically white and Christian. And with this flood of immigrants from Africa and from the Middle East, there were enough of these people who were culturally concerned about that and reacting against it, that just fueled populism. And the two of those things, economics and culture, together are really explosive. And so, this is not a Trump thing. This is a worldwide thing. And it's not going to go away. With Trump out of office, there's still going to be globalization and technological change and immigration and populist anger that's just sitting there waiting for politicians to take advantage of, and they will.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned immigration because I wanted to go a little deeper into that. It seems that populism is unable to coexist with pluralism, and because of immigration, many people many populists see that as a disadvantage, whereas I think many other people think that, at least in this country, that immigration is a positive thing for this country. Is there any way that the populists can be reassured? Do you think that immigration can work to the advantage of this country and to the advantage of those people?
So let me say a couple of things about this, because I think basically the political economy of immigration, like the political economy of globalization, is one in which these are, in the main, decidedly good for countries. The story here is not that, you know, a dark cloud has descended upon the United States across the board. The story here instead is one of these changes, which are big and structural, have in one moment on net, they're quite positive, but that there are people, there are individuals and communities that do in fact suffer, that do in fact lose jobs. And our country has not been especially good at attending to the fallout of the negative consequences of these changes, one. And two, then what the populace does, and a lot of this is elite driven, what the populace does is tap into that insecurity, that precarity, and foment the anger, right? And racialize the anger. And so there certainly is a room here for leadership to at once talk about the benefits that flow from these things, but also a part of leadership is to use the apparatus of government to attend to the fallout. And we have not done an especially good job of that. And so when immigration takes the form of a sense among citizens that the gates are just open and there's not a attention to who is coming or the size of the flow, or with globalization, that there's little attention paid to the fallout of open and liberalized trade policy that that really can have a deleterious effect for certain communities. That's what leads to the sense that, you know, they don't care about me. They never did care about me. And that sensibility is then ripe for a populist to step in and deploy it for his own demagogic, anti-democratic purposes.
You know, I think this is probably a good time to bring up the subject of white backlash, because a big part of the populist rage is based on white backlash. And the white backlash is all about white people in this country losing their position of traditional dominance. White people have always been the dominant group in this country, but soon they won't be. And for, I think, you know, millions and millions of white people in this country, that's fine. You know, diversity is a good thing. This is nothing to be concerned about. It's something to value. But for millions and millions of other people, it's something to fear. And those people have rushed to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has become the white party, and it's seeking to hang on to the past and to prevent this tipping point from happening. And so a big part of populism is anti-other, anti-white. Trump spends a lot of his time demonizing foreigners, minorities, people who are not American white Christians. And throughout Europe, the same kind of thing happens. It's white people afraid of losing their traditional position of dominance. And so I think for many of us, you think, well, yeah, diversity is a good thing, but for populists, this is a way to incite anger and grievance and reaction and rage.
Okay, thank you. maybe this is a little speculative, but what form do you think Trumpism, for want of a better word, it will take after January of next year? And do you see any potential leaders emerging? Do you have any guesses?
So Trumpism for us in the main is populism. That's what we mean. Trump is not your traditional conservative, and to say he's not the traditional conservative is to recognize that while he has, over the last 3.5, 4 years, to play along with some traditional conservatives, what makes him distinctive are these populist appeals that we've been talking about up until now. He has opened up a lane, and he has built a base, and he has captured a party, and in the same way that what matters is, when understanding this present moment, is to not fixate on Trump. What we ought to be doing is fixating on the preconditions that allow for populism to arise and the particular nature of the threat that it presents to democracy. I think what I'd be inclined to say, I'm guessing, Terry, you're going to agree with me, is that, look, this lane remains open, and it may be Trump himself 4 years from now who runs again, at which point he will be the same age as Biden is now. It could be one of his siblings. It could be Tucker Carlson. But that's not where the action is. The action isn't trying to figure out who the person is. The action is to make sense of and to come to terms with the political play and the threat that they present. And that's about sowing anger, disaffection, pushing back against democracy, tearing down institutions in the service of one's own personal political power. And in that sense, who it could be, it could well be somebody who we don't know. Nobody was thinking in 2012 it's going to be, the guy from Celebrity Apprentice who's going to be our next president. And that may be true now. But I think what we ought to be preparing ourselves for is that what Trump has done is he has once demonstrated the returns of populist appeals, just as he has coalesced this group and fomented that anger. There's 71 million people, again, who voted for him. They're not going away.
It's important to talk about Trump and think about what his future is. He's a powerful political leader. He's a focus of attention, but I think it's also very important, and we emphasize this in our book, to sit back from it all and see the larger social forces that are at work. Trump rose to power because globalization and technological change and immigration, these huge disruptive forces, worldwide forces, had disruptive impacts on millions of people and brought about a populist movement that he took advantage of. And now that he's lost the election, globalization and technological change and immigration are still there. They're going to be there tomorrow, and they're going to be there next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. And that's why this populist base is not going to go away. It's not just because Donald Trump is still there. It's because the sources of populism are still there. And they're not there just for us. They're there throughout the Western world. And that is the thing that is so dangerous. And that is the thing that I think the Biden administration needs to be thinking about as it moves forward. Because if it's going to bring about a normalization of our democracy and save our democracy, it's going to have to adopt policies and reforms that will really respond to this underlying anger and to the needs of these people and win them back so that they are no longer anti-system.
Okay. Can we now turn a little bit to the Constitution, which you point out we have great respect for, almost religious respect for. And as you mentioned in your book, it was written 250 or so years ago for a small agrarian population who were pretty much isolated from the rest of the world. How do you feel that this is ill-equipped today to deal with the problems we face? And what changes would you like to see in the Constitution that would help us going forward and reduce the effect of populism?
So there's a lot to be said on the back end. Let's emphasize and underscore the front end first, though, which is that, again, right, this Constitution was written at a time when we were a nation of 3.7 million people, and just about everybody was a farmer, and there were 700,000 slaves, and the only people who participated in politics in a meaningful way, who were allowed to participate in politics, were white property men. And the government wasn't supposed to do much, and in fact, the government didn't do much. And what do you know? The notion that somehow the institutions that they built might be ill-suited to meet the kinds of challenges that our country faces today, right? That maybe what we inherited isn't quite what we need. The notion that that somehow is, requires a whole lot of head scratching is, well, it's disappointing, because what we see instead is a whole lot of effort to kind of prostrate before the founders and to channel the founders and to say, what would the founders think? What would the founders want us to do? In fact, our democracy is at sea. The way we recapture it is by undertaking the work of preservation and resurrection, rather than undertaking the work of reimagination and owning and thinking anew about the problems that we face and the kinds of institutions that we need. And so a big chunk of the work that Terry and I have tried to do with this book is to suggest some particular ways in which the presidency in particular ought to be reimagined. The work doesn't end with the presidency, of course, but we see the president playing a vital role in thinking anew about how we might get a government that can solve problems. We might get a government that can meet the challenges that our country faces. And that's going to require institutional change and thinking outside of this kind of constitutional paradigm and reimagining it and reconstituting it anew. So Terry, do you want to say a bit about, either qualifying or extending what I've said, but also say a bit about how we ought to think about that institutional reform?
Both of us could talk all day on this.
Yeah.
But basically, look, as Wiliam said, we have a government that was designed 235 years ago, by people who had no idea what the problems of modern society would look like. They didn't design a government for today. And there should be no mystery that we have a government that doesn't work today. It can't solve modern problems efficiently. And what does that lead to? It leads to a population that thinks that the government is bad, and they don't like it. And millions of them are anti-system. We need a government that can actually meet the needs of people. Okay, so that means that we need to reform this government. We need to get beyond this worship of the framers and start thinking about how we can restructure the government in ways that are practical and make it work better. So one reform that we talk about in our book that would help streamline the legislative process, which God knows needs help, is the following. Suppose, if many of you probably know that in international trade, there have often been laws in place that allow for trade agreements to be dealt with through fast track, right? And what we recommend is that all policy issues be dealt with through fast track, all of them. So what would happen is that the president, who uniquely among all elected officials has a national perspective, is driven by his legacy to seek policy solutions to pressing national problems, that the president design policies and submit them to Congress. Congress would be required to vote within X number of days, say 90 days. They would have to vote up or down. They couldn't change it. They can vote no, right? But they couldn't stall. They couldn't stash it away in a committee somewhere, right? They have to vote. Everybody has to vote. And that would ensure that the president's legislation would get a vote. The presidents aren't just going to submit any old thing. There would be a lot of bargaining beforehand, before something is submitted. But if we had fast track in place in the past, we would have immigration reform now. We would have had it under President Bush because the votes were there and it died on the filibuster twice. And under Obama, virtually the same kind of package failed because John Boehner wouldn't bring it up for a vote. Well, suppose Boehner didn't have that power, and suppose there was no filibuster. Suppose both the House and the Senate had to vote on a majority basis, and they had to vote. The votes were there. Immigration reform would have passed. So something fairly simple like that, and this is something with a 40-year history, that really can be adopted without a constitutional amendment. That would really streamline the legislative process. And what we're suggesting is people need to think creatively about our government and stop worshiping it. It's not as though once we get rid of Trump and get back to, you know, our real government, everything's going to be okay. It's not going to be okay. We have a government that doesn't work very well. We need to make it work well.
There's another piece. I want to throw out another piece of this, which is important for us to keep in mind, which is that Terry underscored a key reform that we lay out in the book that's in the service of leveraging the promise of the presidency, the kind of unique national perspective that presidents stand to offer, and that we need that in our politics, in our national politics, if we're going to meet things like rising inequality between the rich and the poor, if we're going to meet challenges like global climate change, if we're going to meet the challenges presented by globalization and immigration. There also is, and we talk about this at some length, what we call, borrowing from a colleague from UCLA, what we call the fear of presidential power, the justifiable fear of presidential power. That is, when a demagogue occupies the office, they could deploy the powers to considerable ill effect. And there's reason to be worried about what kind of power we vest in the presidency. And so we lay out a host of other institutional reforms with an eye towards guarding against the profound damage that should a demagogue occupy the office, which is what we've seen over the last 3.5, 4 years, the profound damage they can do to the administrative state, to our democracy, to basic notions of expertise, to the health of our system of government. And so we lay out a host of reforms on that front as well, because what we need to do, if we're going to protect our democracy, is at once figure out how we can get a government that actually works, that can solve problems, isn't just representative and responsive, but that solves problems, is effective. We need that, and we also need to worry about the possibility, again, that a demagogue might assume the office, and we need to protect against it. And that's the two-pronged test that we need to be thinking about when we think about institutional reforms to the American presidency, and creating a presidency for modern times, and not simply inheriting that which not just relying upon that which we inherited from our founders.
Okay, talking about reforms, what about electoral reforms, the Electoral College, for example? Is it time for it to go? Are there other electoral reforms that you think could strengthen our democracy and guard against populism?
Yes and no, right? I mean, yes, in the sense that we are no fans of the Electoral College, and we would be delighted to see it go. And in fact, if we got rid of the Electoral College, to the extent that presidents channel national concerns, they would have all the more incentive to do so, because every 4 years they wouldn't fixate their attention on 5 states and ignore all of you good people out in California, right? Or ignore all the good people here in Illinois, right? So for sure, let's get rid of the Electoral College. There are also other challenges associated with money in politics, other pathologies and perversions to our democracy. But at the core of what we need, when we think about pushing back against the threat of populism, again, is a government that works, that is effective, that can solve problems. And just because we get rid of money in politics, or just because we get rid of the Electoral College, as long as we're working within a system of government that's designed as it is, and Congress is designed as it is, it's going to be remarkably difficult to make headway in a serious way to pass the kind of comprehensive, systemic, intellectually well-justified policies that we need to meet the challenges of modernity. Again, this is, when we think about the health of our government, it's not just a problem of representation or responsiveness. Those are real problems, to be sure, but it's not just that. It's also about, do we have a government that can work, that can solve problems, which is why we want to get into the kind of the machinery of government and thinking anew about the relationship of the president to Congress and the powers that are endowed with each.
So, Terry, do you have anything to add to that one? You usually both chip in.
I always have something to add. I just don't know whether I should, you know. Okay, I will. Look, this is just something that I thought William put it well, but it's important to recognize that populism is really not about democracy. It's an anti-democracy movement, ultimately. And it's at the heart now of the Republican Party. It's essentially taken over the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is now an anti-democracy party. And that's true for two reasons. One, populism is at its heart. And also because demography is moving against it, right? And so the more minorities there are in this country, the more Republicans don't want them to vote, right? Republicans are afraid of majority rule. And that's why they're so aggressively pursuing voter ID laws, purging registration rolls, making sure that ex-felons can't vote, making sure that voting by mail is minimized, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want people to vote. So what's happened in this country is that we now have two parties, but one of those parties is actually an anti-democracy party. And so when you talk about, hey, can't we make this system more democratic by getting rid of the Electoral College, you know, and doing some obvious things? Yes, we could. But one of the parties is going to be opposed to that and to all reforms that make our system more democratic. And because the framers, in their wisdom, created a system that's filled with checks and balances and veto points, the Republicans will almost always be able to block almost any efforts to make the system more democratic. And that's one of the great dilemmas going forward.
Okay. One of the things, I mean, I'm a believer, having read your book, you've convinced me, but the things that I'm concerned about is there are a bunch of very pressing problems for the new administration: coronavirus, affordable health care, unemployment, climate change, the list goes on. And do you think there is going to be therefore the interest, if you like, the bandwidth to tackle some of these proposals which you're making, along with all those other things which are competing for the time of our politicians?
Stuart, I mean, you put your finger on it, in that there are pressing needs now. Like, the government needs to do something now. The Biden administration needs to get to work. If the first move of the Biden administration is to say, I read, you know, Howell and Moe's really interesting book, and I'm going to ignore the pandemic and ignore climate change and first set to work on reconstituting our institutions, right? Politically, he's not going to fare especially well. He's got to do something. Yes, that's decidedly true, and we're in a position to give him and them counsel. We would recommend as much. The fear, though, that we have is that the Democratic Party, now having reclaimed the White House, will say, the threat now is past. We now can set to work on simply passing liberal policy and ignore the institutional work at hand. That as long as our institutions remain as broken as they are, we will continue to fail to attend to the big challenges that stand before us. It's not to say that the government won't do anything, or that the actions that are available to us now are entirely inconsequential. They're not. We can do things. We must do things. But we need a government that allows for, that facilitates problem solving. We don't have that government now. And so, like, the answer is yes, and yes, we need to, a Biden administration needs to get to work and pass policies aggressively to attend to the immediate challenges that stand before us. And the Biden administration needs to say, you know what? The government doesn't work so well. And we need to reimagine what these institutions are, and to roll up its sleeves and set to work on reconstituting those institutions. We don't have the luxury of choosing one or the other. And again, our fear is that Democrats will neglect the latter work because they'll celebrate all the accomplishments associated with, undoing Trump's executive orders, passing legislation where it's possible, and pushing out policy change where available, but not do the work, the deep institutional work of reconstituting our political institutions.
I think that's beautifully put, and I'll just add a little icing on the cake, which is, now that Biden has won, I think many people are going to heave a big sigh of relief and think that we can get back to normal. And if the Biden administration moves ahead as a normal liberal administration, this is going to lead to failure in the end, because underneath it all is this seething mass of populist anger. And unless something is done very specifically and strategically by the Biden people to diffuse populism, it's going to be there. It's going to stay there, because these big social forces continue. Right. And so if I think the Democrats can dominate in the future politically if they're strategic about this, if they make government more effective, and if they go after populism directly to undermine it, to diffuse it. But they can't just think that things are going to be normal now. If the populists get back in control, if they take the presidency in the future, God help us.
And God help us, because what we can imagine is, with a Trump 2.0, somebody more disciplined, that their hold on the Republican Party being all the more entrenched, and their sense of urgency in rolling back our democracy, given this ongoing demographic changes that disadvantage them, will be felt even more acutely. And that collectively will, that constitutes an acute threat that we need to be prepared for.
Okay, and again, thinking about barriers to the changes you're suggesting, one of the things that concerns me is essentially, as you pointed out a little earlier, that you would like to see is effectively an increase in presidential power, in being able to, and I agree with safeguards, I understand all that, but nevertheless, with being able to set priority on legislation. And I'm worried that people are going to look at what's just happened in this country and say, no, we must diminish the president greatly. And do you see that as a barrier? And do you see other barriers that, because of our recent history, might occur?
Terry, you lead with this one.
There are plenty of barriers, I think that the knee-jerk reaction of everyone is, wow, presidents need to be made less powerful. Now, Okay, fine. We agree with that. That in some respects, presidents need to be made less powerful. We need to protect ourselves against an authoritarian president. And in our book, we outline ways that that can be done. But it's a mistake not to recognize the great promise that presidents have to offer for effective government. We need presidents for a more effective government. What we have is a government that is very fragmented. It's filled with checks and balances and veto points, and it's very difficult to get this government to work in an effective way. Presidents are unique in having this national perspective, in caring about their legacy, in wanting to craft policies that work. And we need for them to take the lead and to mobilize Congress and get these things passed. And to do that, we need reforms that actually give them more power in some ways to do that. And that's why we recommend fast track. You know, Congress can vote no, right? So it's not as though the president would be a dictator. The president can lose, right? But it allows for a much more streamlined process that would make the government more effective and take advantage of the president being a champion of effective government compared to all the other elected officials in government. So I think what it takes to get something like that through is for President Biden to advocate it and to explain it to people, and for people in Congress on the Democratic side to support it and say, we need to do this so that we can streamline our process and actually get something done for the American people. I don't think that's a radical proposal. I think it's the president and Congress working together. And we've had it in international trade for 40 years.
Okay, I'm going to pose one more question, then I'm going to see if I can pick some of the questions from the those that have been put in chat. And meanwhile, everybody, I would encourage you, if you haven't already put your question into chat, start typing now. I guess my last point was, do you think the Republican Party has or will learn a lesson from Trump's defeat? And how do you think that might play out?
Well, we might hope that there would be a reckoning if you're on the left. I mean, we've got a group of Democrats on this call, that there would be a kind of, the discussions would look like the discussions in the aftermath of Romney's defeat. And they would say, what our problem is that we need to reach a more diverse group of Americans, and we need to reconsider the positions that we've had. I guess I'd like to suggest that in the aftermath of this election, that's not likely to be the lessons that are drawn. What's likely to be the lessons that are drawn is that we can get 71 million votes around the country if we go this route. And we picked up seats in the House. And while there is a chance that we will lose the Senate, it is just probabilistically a long shot. And that what we have had demonstrated with Trump are the remarkable political rewards associated with playing from the populist playbook, which is why Republicans right now are perfectly willing to stand by him while he behaves in ways that are absolutely atrocious from a small d Democratic standpoint. I mean, the positions that he's taking, the arguments that he's leveling are profoundly abhorrent, and yet you have an entire party that doesn't dare cross him. The only people who do are there are a handful of people, a tiny handful of people who are willing to even sort of speak out against it. And so, yes, again, we could hope that the lesson would be, you see, if you behave the way Trump does, you're going to lose. Alternatively, what you might say is, no, this is the play. This is the play. What you should do is maybe curb some of the excesses when the rhetoric comes, but populism is the way to survive, at least for a while, in an environment in which, because of profound demographic change, we as Republicans are electorally challenged. And in that's yet another reason why this populism isn't going to go away.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and also put a slightly different spin on it, which is that the populist base is powerful. And Trump is going to remain powerful, manipulating and using that base. And Republican politicians are cowards and afraid of that base. And they will do what they need to do to save their own necks. And what that means is that populism is going to be in the driver's seat. I think the populists have captured the Republican Party. And going forward, the Republican Party is going to be even more anti-democracy. And this is going to be a real struggle, right? The lesson is not, gee whiz, we need to do something different. What they've been doing has been working quite well as far as they're concerned. And there's also a big whip over
Turn
them.
this sideways.
And this is what you see. I mean, so the turn is, right, the Republican Party has learned to fall in love with the judiciary. It believes deeply suddenly in the Electoral College and the Senate. And the rhetoric has shifted away from, right, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. This is all part of a story that's about making investments in the least democratic institutions of our national politics, because that's where they can hold on a while in a world that is changing and cutting against them. And so to the extent that they can place their bets on the least democratic institutions and foment this anger and disaffection that is channeled through populism in order to fight where they can, that's the play that we should expect in the years ahead.
Okay.
It's not hopeful, is it, Stuart?
All right. You can accuse me of prejudice if you like, but I'm going to ask a question from a fellow Brit. Should the founding fathers have adopted a parliamentary system?
Yes, but they didn't.
Yeah, I know.
No, I think that William and I both agree that a parliamentary system is a more effective form of government, and also that we can't get there from here. Right, we're stuck with the form of government that was designed 235 years ago, and all we can do at this point is to make marginal adjustments to that architecture.
Okay, let me see if I've got anything else that we haven't really covered. Are there any areas which you'd like to bring up that you think we haven't covered? I was personally wondering about the, you talk about keeping control of the security system better, so that the president can't challenge it in the way that that Trump has done. But are there any other things you'd like to bring up as well?
Yeah, let's just briefly sort of survey the kinds of institutional reforms that we have in mind that are meant to guard against demagoguery and the threat that presidents present. You've identified one, which is the need to insulate the national intelligence agencies and the Department of Justice, because these are profoundly powerful domains of federal government, and a world in which they can be captured by a demagogue in order to punish enemies, reward friends, and protect against any investigations into their own misbehavior is to put us on the fast road to democratic decline. We need an independent Department of Justice and independent agencies, intelligence agencies, just as we argue on behalf of reducing the politicization of the administrative state. We need a professional bureaucracy, one in which experts are rewarded for their expertise. And when presidents, as they can now in the United States, flood the administrative state with political lackeys, that has the effect, with a whole lot of research that shows that has the effect of undermining, through a variety of mechanisms, undermining expertise. We talk about a variety of ways in which we might put checks on the president's unilateral powers, not eliminate them altogether, but put some checks on them. And in particular, when it comes to the president's national emergency powers, the president's ability to simply declare, oh, there's an emergency on the southern border, and so I'm thereby going to claim new powers that are going to allow me to reallocate funds to build a wall that Congress refused to support repeatedly. There are particular reforms that we can implement that would make that more difficult, and that would be to the good. Just as we want to get rid of the president's pardon power, which presidents have no business having, and we want to attend to issues involving conflicts of interest. So there's a whole host of reforms that we walk through that are meant to shore up protections against the threat that demagogues present to our democracy. Presidents stand to offer something, and we need to take that. We can't just shut down the presidency, but we also need to recognize the threat that they present. And so that gives you a sense of the kinds of institutional reforms that we have in mind in trying to check the president.
Terry, anything there?
Nope, I think William did a great job.
Oh, okay. In my asking you, I wasn't implying he hadn't. Yeah, was one thing that, yeah, you mentioned presidential pardon. Can he pardon himself? Do we know?
We don't know. And the idea that you're asking that question is frightening, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
And probably relevant because he might pardon himself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have to steel ourselves for a lot of pardons coming up before he leaves office. He'll pardon members of his family, friends, for things they haven't been indicted for. You know, it's going to be a real interesting situation.
Okay. I think we've about cut most of the other. What I'm looking at in chat is really comments rather than questions for you. I suppose, well, the one question from Renee Buxter, but we sort of covered that, is, are there any countries that have solved these problems efficiently, and who are they? What did they do?
You know, I think in general, the European countries have done a much better job of dealing with populism than we have. And the reason is that they have parliamentary systems and they have welfare states. And because they have welfare states, when people are unemployed and when they experience various kinds of stresses in their lives, there's a safety net there for them. They have healthcare, they have childcare, all the rest, right? And those kinds of grievances are taken away. And what happened really that gave rise to the power of populist parties several years ago was that influx of immigration that the nations of Europe handled badly for a little while. And that fueled a surge of populist anger, and it looked really dangerous for a while. But then those countries got their act together and they actually handled their immigration problem, and support for the populist parties over there has dropped off. And so I think that over the long haul, they're in a much better position to deal with the populist threat than we are. The countries that have really been subjected to populist authoritarianism are Hungary, especially, and Poland, Eastern European countries that have an authoritarian past and culture. And I think that has been their big problem.
Okay, one point I was reminded me, which I think I'm not seeing the question, but I think it was there somewhere, was you said that the demographics are changing against the Republicans. But there again, one looks at what happened in Florida this time, and it seemed like a lot of Cuban Americans and other Latino groups voted for Trump. And this is something I always find it hard to understand anybody voting for Trump, but particularly among those groups. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So a thing that we've learned, and you know, it's sobering that we need to learn it in 2020, but here it is that, you know, Hispanics and Latinos are not of a piece. There's real diversity within the group, and that Cuban Americans have different politics than do Mexican Americans or Americans from Central America. And I think when you say that in the main demographic changes are not playing to the president's advantage, the way to see that is with regard to Texas. It didn't happen this year, but all signs point towards either in 2024 or in 2028 that Texas could well break blue. And when Texas breaks blue, then we're going to be in a world in which California, New York, and Texas, all three are going to be aligned solidly with the Democratic Party. And that is a world in which it's going to be all but impossible for Republicans, as they're currently constituted, to compete. So that's the sense of urgency, I think, that Republicans ought to feel in channeling that populist rage and in pushing back against the expansion of the franchise and reducing the reach of democracy. Because should they lose Texas, at least when it comes to presidential politics, they're going to be playing from a profound disadvantage. And so, yes, there are some demographic changes, or there are some groups that are not white who don't uniformly oppose Trump, but in the main, these trends don't bode well for presidential politics in presidential politics when it comes to the Republican Party.
You know, I think it's worth pointing out that the Cubans are the group that is the outlier group among Hispanics. And they're really focused on Cuba and on communism. And that's one reason why the Republicans talk so much about communism, especially in Florida, right? They're trying to stir up support among the Cubans, and it works, you know, because that really matters to them. But among the other Hispanic groups, and there are differences among them, that's just not true. And I think over the decades, basically Hispanics have voted 2-to-1 Democrat. And I think when all the data are in for this year's election, and they're not all in, I think what they'll show is that the Hispanics voted 2-to-1 for Democrats. And that's one reason why Republicans don't want them to vote. You know, they try to pass all these laws that suppress the minority vote. It's not just the Black vote, it's also the Hispanic vote. It's because they tend to vote Democrat. And ultimately, this is going to go against them, and ultimately, they're going to lose the entire Southwest. And there are also many Hispanics in Georgia and elsewhere. It looks very bad for Republicans. And I think in the short term, they're just going to become more and more and more anti-democracy in order to try to combat the rising tide of minorities in this country. It's a very dangerous thing.
Okay, I have one last question, but I was wondering if I could turn it over to Brodie for a moment. Do you have anything you'd like to ask Brodie before we wrap it up?
Yes. Yes. In your book, you point out that Congress is not responsive to the needs of people because legislation, quote, satisfies powerful supporters. And so it seems like our campaign system should be reformed. For example, getting rid of Citizens United and requiring campaign reform as proposed by Congressman John Sarbanes, who advocates for public financing of campaigns. All the reforms listed are in the We the People Act, which has been passed by the House and is waiting for the Senate to approve this legislation that would expand voting rights, limit partisan gerrymandering, strengthen ethic rules, and limit the influence of private donor money in politics. Do you think this would be a good way to reform our government?
So if Terry and I were in Congress and we were asked to vote on that, I suspect we would both vote yes, right? Yes, all that would be to the good. And we would still, though, have a legislative institution wherein you have 535 voting people who are representing 50 states and 435 different districts. And a collective decision-making body designed that way, you can count on channeling parochial concerns. There's a reason why special interest politics is that Congress is the epicenter of special interest politics that goes beyond simply problems of money in politics. It has to do with the design of Congress. Now, we don't say that Congress doesn't represent anybody or does nothing whatsoever. There's a case to be made that in our national politics, we ought to have a branch of government that is particularly attuned to local interests and that will say, hey, the good people of San Ramon are concerned about this policy affecting us, and they have representation. But when you're looking for solutions to big problems like thinking about comprehensive immigration reform or a coherent tax policy or how to meet the challenge of global climate change that represents that recognizes the problems in its complexity and in its entirety, that doesn't think, well, there's global climate change, something ought to be done, but let's make sure that there are carve-outs and exceptions and protections for the organized interests in my district, which is what you can expect legislators to channel in doing their job, not in, breaking from their promise, but in fulfilling their promise. This is again where, yes, let's get rid of the Electoral College. Let's also attend to problems of money in politics, but the institutional design of Congress all but ensures that we're not going to build comprehensive, well-justified, well-integrated solutions to big problems. And for that, we need presidential leadership.
What about wealth inequality? How would your reforms affect and decrease wealth inequality?
So again, I add this to the list of big structural problem, right? There are big disagreements to be had about how one addresses that challenge. But the idea that Congress as a collective decision-making body is going to deliver us in meeting that challenge, right, by virtue of how it's designed, right? No, this is where you need presidential leadership. Somebody who's going to say, here's how you think about the whole. Here's how you think about what comprehensive reform might look like. Now, there are a variety of avenues we might take. So we aren't laying out policy prescriptions in this book. We're not saying, here's how you solve specifically the things. What we're doing is trying to point towards the institutions that we need to allow for the possibility that such reforms might emerge.
If you have a stronger president, why would they want to, and they have their campaign is dependent upon wealthy supporters. Why would they want to even get rid of wealth inequality then? I mean, they have no motivation.
Let me just jump in
Okay,
here.
sorry.
I think that, people who have policy objectives, like the ones you've been laying out, which are objectives that we would agree with, normally think that the way to achieve those objectives is to make government more democratic, by, let's say, getting money out of politics and that kind of thing. And I think, those are good things to do. We would support those kinds of reforms, and we say so in our book. But what people almost never think about is that even if you could make government more democratic, we would still have a government that's really grossly ineffective. And it's ineffective because of the structure of the government. That's what nobody ever pays any attention to. They think if we can just make it more democratic, everything will be great, and we can pass all this great legislation and take care of the country's problems. The fact of the matter is we have a government that can't do these things effectively. Even when all the stars are lined up and they can pass legislation, they pass legislation that consists of these cobbled together patchwork sets of provisions that are not well integrated, well justified attacks on social problems. And it's for structural reasons because we have a government that isn't set up to do that.
No, I understand that. And I was saying, given that we have the reforms that you're suggesting, a more powerful presidency that would suggest legislation and that they have to fast track, where are you going to find a president that would want to get rid of money in politics when their campaign is dependent upon it?
So look, there are no guarantees. I mean, we don't come into this and say, adopt our institutional reforms and all will be well. There are no guarantees in that. Even if everything is adopted, you can't count on us getting a president then who's going to say global climate change is a real thing and we need to set to work on it, right? That's where, we live with the consequences of the people who are chosen. The question is, can we set up a set of institutions that allow for the possibility that meaningful reform might happen? You're pointing, I think, in this particular instance, Brodie, to a deeper problem, which we can generalize, which is how do you reform a system, not just with regard to money in politics, but with regard to institutional change, wherein certain people stand to benefit from the status quo, wherein their hold on power is contingent upon the maintenance of the institution as it's currently organized. And that's a real challenge. It's a profound problem. We can look, if we kind of scan back over the last century and we think about changes to the American presidency, there have been profound changes. So the 1970 Trade Act, which gave the president fast track authority, was born of a recognition on the part of enough legislators that they couldn't be counted on not to, at every turn, in their effort to curry favor with organized interest, lard up trade agreements with all kinds of exceptions and carve-outs, which made international trade all but impossible. If you go back to the 1921 Budget Act, that was an instance too, where agenda setting authority was given to the president because members of Congress recognized that they were not well equipped to meet the challenges of writing a coherent federal budget. And so they turned to presidential leadership in this space. Are there going to be instances where a president, by virtue of his power base, is going to disavow other kinds of reforms that might be good for democracy? That may well be true. And you might have your finger on one. But I think what we're trying to do with this book is to underscore the need for the institutional reform. But without being, looking upon them with kind of a sense of, now that we've identified them, they'll automatically be passed, right? We are well aware of the profound challenges that stand in our way. But unless we get to work on doing, undertaking this kind of institutional reform, we're going to be in real trouble, and we're going to be vulnerable to the entreaties of populists, and our democracy will remain in a state of crisis.
Okay.
Shall we think about wrapping it up now? I would certainly, if I may, like to make a plug for your wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it. I found it very educational. I felt it was written for somebody like myself who is not a political scientist, and it was very easy to read in a page turner. So thank you very much for that. And I would encourage all of you guys who are out there today to consider getting the book. You can get it on Kindle if you want to go that way. And maybe we can put the link onto our website, Brodie, for the book if it's not already there.
Yeah.
I think that the hardback copy was about $90, so I was.
And the paperback copy is a whole lot cheaper.
Yes.
The Kindle is cheap.
Yes.
And I guess I'd like to end on an upbeat note, if we can, from both of you, with the simple question of what gives you hope?
Good question.
Well, I can start it off. Donald Trump lost. And I think that had to happen. If he had won another 4-year term, I think it could have been a death blow to American democracy. And I think with the new administration, we have a real chance of turning the page and of having a president who can take steps to win over some of the populist base. What they want is to have their concerns and anxieties and needs paid attention to by a Democratic administration. Joe Biden is going to win this thing by more than 5 million votes. And if the Democrats can take the right actions to win over some portion of that base, they can win next time by much more than that. And they need to continue along this line. They need to win the Senate. And then they need to adopt really big New Deal type reforms that can bring us a much more effective government and really diffuse populism.
Hear, hear. I want to end with that.
Oh, well, thank you everybody for attending, and a big thank you to our guest speakers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Enjoy it.
Brodie, do you have any farewell words before we shut it down? You're muted, Brodie.
I want to thank Professor Terry Moe and Wiliam Howell for joining us. It was a really interesting and discussion. And thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. We look forward to you all being together November 24th, where we're going to have Congressman Mark DeSaulnier. And also remember to get out and click the link for Fair Fight and mobilize to work for Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock for the Georgia Senate. Well, the Senate, for our Senate. So they have a runoff election January 5th. So it's time to get to work now. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Oh, great.
Another excellent meeting, Brodie.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Hi, Renee.
Hi.
Thank
Quicker
you.
than flying to Chicago, right?
Thank you, everyone. And thank you. And thank you, Stuart, for being such a wonderful moderator. Oh my goodness.
Brodie, what's the name of the book?
The book is Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy. It's on our website.
Thank you.
I'll type it in chat, which
Thank
I've done.
I thought that was a terrific meeting.
Yeah, it was good.
Good job.
Thank you.
Good.